Hi, everyone. My name is Zoe Glover, and today I'm going to be talking about a clinical trial which used fecal microbiota transplantation to help investigate and relieve symptoms of children with autism spectrum disorder. And it investigated both gastrointestinal symptoms and behavioral symptoms in autism. So the bottom line, why does this matter? Why do we care? Why are people doing FMT to help mediate autism? So 1 in 36 children are born with autism spectrum disorder, and we don't know the causes. There are genetic factors, environmental factors, and there isn't too much of a consensus about what causes this. And also because of this, there are very few physical treatments available. Most of the treatments are psychotherapy centered. And there is, however, known to be a high comorbidity and correlation with autism spectrum disorder and gastrointestinal issues. And so this study seeks out to show whether treating gastrointestinal issues using fecal microbiota transplantation from a healthy donor, will it show significant differences in, yes, the GI tract, but also in the behavioral and neurological symptoms that are typically present in ASD. And this is important because it's a relatively non-invasive treatment, and it does have some promising results from this clinical trial. So a little bit of background to understand is that autism spectrum disorder is a neurodevelopmental disorder, and it's marked by deficits in social communication, and there are a lot of restricted and repetitive behavior patterns, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. And autism itself isn't deadly, but it is important to seek these novel treatment methods because the behavioral complications and the social factors and issues surrounding ASD do lead to an increase in mortality. And previous studies have actually shown that there is a link between the microbiome and the development of various neurodevelopmental disorders, such as autism, Parkinson's, and various other things. Actually, a study recently published with one of our professors, Dr. Ahrens, helps prove this. And FMT is a relatively safe way to alter the gut microbiome, and it does this via the gut-brain axis, which is something that we've discussed and seen throughout various presentations this semester, and it's a really up-and-coming form of research for the microbiology field. So the methodology of this study, it was a clinical trial, and there were two cohorts. There were 40 participants who had autism spectrum disorder, and then there were 16 typically developing children. The study took place over 12 weeks. There were 4 weeks of the FMT treatment and then 8 weeks of follow-up. One healthy fecal donor from Southwest China donated to the ASD cohort only. So the ASD cohort were the only group that was actually treated using FMT. The TD cohort did not receive that treatment. And there were 2 methods of FMT, rectal and oral. Oral was the most commonly used, and then rectal methods were used for children who typically had more severe ASD, who had textural issues and issues swallowing pills. So they used the rectal route. Stool samples were taken for all participants repeatedly throughout the trial, and 16S rRNA analysis was conducted. And both gastrointestinal symptoms and ASD symptoms were recorded throughout the course of this trial. So there were a lot of assessment methods used in this trial, so we do need to talk a little bit about what methods were used and what they mean. So on the gastrointestinal side of things, we need to understand the Bristol Stool Form Scale, which is a stool rating method that helps understand how healthy somebody's bowel movements are. There are types 1 through 7. A 4 is the most typical healthy stool ranking, and then a lower ranking closer to 1 would mark constipation, and a higher ranking closer to 7 would mark inflammation, diarrhea, things like that. And then the gastrointestinal symptoms rating scale is a self-rating scale, also from 1 to 7, with 1 being perfectly fine, asymptomatic, painless, and 7 being very severe symptoms, very painful. And then for the assessments used for autism in this study, there's the Childhood Autism Rating Scale, or CARS, which is a 15-item scale, and it's mainly used for diagnosis. It was done multiple times throughout the study. There's a Social Responsiveness Scale, which just the higher the score is, the more that your social responses are associated with autism. There's the Autism Behavior Checklist, or ABC. This assesses various behavioral problems in 5 categories. So we have irritability, lethargy, or tiredness, stereotypy, which is these kind of repetitive marked behaviors often present in ASD. So banging, moving your hands or body often in a pattern, echolachia, which is to almost parrot other sounds or noises frequently. There's as well as hyperactivity, and then inappropriate speech. And then the last autism symptom scale was the self-rating anxiety scale, which is a 20-item scale that actually measures the anxiety of the parents of the children who were in this study. So now that we've understood all of that, we can get into the makeup and the results of this trial. So just to get into more detail about the timeline, the rectal route and the oral route used the exact same dosage, and we can see here that stool samples were taken throughout all of the FMT treatment, which is from weeks 0 to 4. And then every 4 weeks, every single assessment method was taken. At the halfway mark, they took stool samples again. So at week 0, week 4, week 8, and week 12, every single assessment method was taken. And now some similarities and differences between the 2 cohorts. The main thing to take away from this figure is just that the demographics of the TD cohort and the ASD cohort are really similar. Some notable differences, though, are that there were way more children in the ASD cohort, and that ASD children were way more likely to have a food allergy, and were also way more likely to have used oral antibiotics in the first 3 years of their life. You can see here how many of the kids had mild, moderate, and severely assessed ASD, and there were pretty equal distribution here. Another interesting thing to note is that there were hardly any females in this study. This is not a bias of the study, but simply more men are diagnosed with ASD than women. So likely this is why there are way more men in the study than girls. So now we can get into a lot of the results here. This is all of the assessments over time. So graph A's and B are going over the gastrointestinal scores. So we can see here on graph A that at first, this self-rating gastrointestinal issues scale was really high. So people were ranking high issues. And then at the end of FMT at 4 weeks, it went down really drastically in like a linear fashion. And then over the course of the follow-up, we see it getting a little bit closer to baseline. And this is the same thing we see with the Bristol stool score. So we could see that the ASD cohort, all of these results are for those who were treated with FMT, by the way. So these are all for the ASD cohort. None of these graphs are about the TD cohort. So for their stool, we can see that the ASD cohort had a tendency to have low stool rating, which means that they were often constipated. And then after FMT, we see this increase, and it's getting a lot closer to 4, which is what you'd want to see to be perfectly healthy. And then exact same thing over time, over the follow-up, it goes a little bit closer to baseline, but still much better than where it was started. And then for all of these different rating scales for autism, again, we see a very similar thing. We see that the rating is high at the beginning, which means these higher symptoms, higher stereotypy, higher lethargy, higher anxiety for the parents. And then the results are best at the end of FMT and get a little bit closer back to baseline when you get to the end of the trial. But very promising results. So serum level neurotransmitters were also taken throughout this study for the ASD cohort. And so here are the three that were measured. So here on graph A, you have 5-HT or serotonin. At graph B, you have GABA, which is the major inhibitory and excitatory neurotransmitter in the brain, and something that there's been a lot of sort of hype about research about GABA and autism as of late. And then graph C goes over DA or dopamine. And so here we see with both serotonin and GABA that over the course of FMT, both of these neurotransmitters went down drastically and then got way closer back to baseline at the end, very similar to what we saw with the gastrointestinal assessments and the behavioral assessments. But interestingly, dopamine was the opposite. So dopamine increased really starkly at the end of FMT, but then by the time they were 8 weeks out from FMT, their dopamine was actually slightly lower than when the trial was started. So that is interesting to know. And then to talk about the actual microbiome of all of the cohorts now, graph A shows the progression of microbial diversity for the ASD cohort over the course of the study. And there were no significant differences found in the overall alpha diversity of the ASD cohort. So the FMT did not drastically change the makeup of the ASD cohort, but yet we do see all of these really stark changes over the course of ASD in terms of symptoms, in terms of the neurotransmitters, which is fascinating. And how we know, and if you were wondering what these stars mean on all of these graphs, so the NS here on the bars stands for not significant. So these differences are not significant between all the weeks over the course of the study. From week 0 to week 4, there was no significant difference in diversity, and all the way to the end of the study, no significant differences. And then when we talk about the difference between the ASD cohort and the TD cohort over time, we can see this distance here on the y-axis is referring to how far these groups are from each other in terms of similarity. So how different are they, the distance? So when you have a larger distance, it means that their gut microbiome is more different. And when you see the smaller distance, it means that the gut microbiomes are slightly more similar. So between the ASD and the typically developing children who did not have FMT treatment, it was found that over the course of FMT, which are the weeks highlighted down here, that there was a significant difference where the ASD cohort got a little bit more similar to the typically developing children, but after FMT ended, these, similarities did not hold and they kind of went back to baseline. But when you compare the ASD cohort to the donor who gave them the fecal matter for the transplantation, we can see that at every single week, there was statistically different results from week 0. So as time went on, after they were treated with FMT, the ASD cohort's microbial makeup was more similar to their donors, and that these results actually did hold up over time. So even though the symptoms that we saw rated in these past slides started getting closer to baseline, we can see that their microbial makeup was staying more similar to that FMT, which is very promising And again, these stars mean that they are significant. So one star signifies that these differences are unlikely to be due to chance. It means that the p-value is 0.05 or less. And then the more stars there are in between the different weeks, it means the more statistically significant these results are and the lower the p-value is. So overall, from these figures, what we can understand is that alpha diversity wasn't overall changed. So the overall, we couldn't say that they became far more diverse, which in other studies is typically shown to lead to a healthier GI tract. That wasn't seen. We didn't see them, the ASD cohort, having these really significant changes, but we did see them getting a lot closer to their donor's microbiome, which is important. So to kind of talk about all of these results, there are possible links to the serum neurotransmitters and autism, and this could be really important for pharmacological development in the future. This is something that is already being researched. And as I mentioned earlier, in particular to GABA, there is some buzz in the pharmacological community that GABA may have a lot to do with mediating autism, and that, you know, these results may be able to contribute to our understanding of how not just GABA, but dopamine and serotonin are all related to the behaviors and the issues of this disorder. And then there was no figure provided, but this was really important, that a statistical analysis of the neurotransmitters showed that there was a negative correlation between E-copro, which is a specific bacterium that was found more at the beta diversity level. And there's a negative correlation with that and GABA. So as GABA decreased, E-copro increased. This is something that was seen, and this was also something that helped to mediate the difference between those in the ASD cohort who responded really well to FMT and those who didn't have as strong of a response. That difference was mediated by E-copro. So there maybe needs to be an entire other study that really focuses on the mechanisms of E-copro and has some more sequencing for this, so we can help understand with, you know, bigger numbers, more participants, a far wider range of the TD cohort, so we can really see if this is just due to chance, or is there really something significant here with this specific microbe, and that it may in fact be causing autism. But there was a limitation in the results to me, was that FMT didn't overall change the gut microbiome makeup. It was really just that one bacteria, which could be due to various amounts of factors. And we don't know what the mechanisms are behind why it mediates GABA and what that even has to do with autism. So a lot more research needs to be done to help us really understand that. But all in all, these are really promising results, and these kids and their families and parents did find some relief from the stresses of this disorder. And that's what was most important in this clinical trial. And that they got that relief also from their gastrointestinal symptoms. And this may help us for the future understand that maybe, you know, gastrointestinal issues predict these neurodevelopmental issues, or maybe it's the other way around, but that these are tied together and that these treatments shouldn't be separate, they should be together. And there are no mechanisms mentioned in the study for why or how the microbiome mediates ASD, but there are very clear correlations with the symptoms, the neurotransmitter levels, and the E-copro in this study specifically was definitely statistically significant at the bare minimum. So those are kind of the key takeaways from all of these figures. And now the questions I leave for you guys is, do you think that this study could further inspire pharmacological research about how neurotransmitters mediate ASD? And what are the benefits versus the drawbacks of a pharmaceutical treatment versus an FMT treatment? Talking about how invasive it is, side effects, things like that. Another one is that this study was conducted in Southwest China, which is a region very different from where we live. And, possibly these results, and especially those revolving around the specific bacterium that was mediating GABA, this may be very regionally specific. And so do you think that that's a confounding factor in trying to generalize these results and say that, the gut microbiome is going to help all children with ASD? Or do you think that these results can and should be more widespread? Third, how can FMT be integrated into the treatment plans that already exist for children with ASD, which take a more psychotherapy model? Should FMT completely replace the psychotherapy model, since we've seen such good results from this in these studies? Or should it simply be incorporated into the psychotherapy that already exists? And then this clinical trial, it had a lot of different independent variables going on with the gastrointestinal symptoms, the GABA, the microbial diversity, the behavioral symptoms. So which results would you personally want to investigate further, and why? And then lastly, if you were to recreate this study, would you change anything? And what are some limitations that you found in this study that you think you can improve on? And that's all I have for you guys today. I'm happy to hear what you have to say. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye. So there was no figure provided on this, but I thought it was important to discuss a actual specific bacterium that was found at the beta level to have a large difference in the diversity over the course of the FMT, and that there were correlations that were found with this Eubacterium coprostanolegens and GABA. And there were also correlations found between this, I'll call it E-copro, and the ASD cohort who responded really well to the FMT and the ones who didn't respond as well, or the non-responders. And so it was found that at week 12, there was a negative correlation between E-copro and GABA, and also that overall, as E-copro decreased, we saw that these GI tract issues were decreasing. So there is a possible link between this class of bacteria and the mediation of autism, and that FMT, in perhaps part of the start of understanding the mechanism behind how this FMT was mediating the GI symptoms and the autism symptoms, is via E-copro, and that decreasing E-copro over the course of FMT did actually have an impact. And so this is where we really see how the FMT did in fact impact the microbiome, but on a more individual basis. And there were other significant differences in between the TD cohort and the ASD cohort's microbiomes, but none that seemed to be mediated by FMT, except for this really, really particular E-copro that was found to be statistically significant with the neurotransmitter GABA, and what caused people to be non-responsive versus responsive to FMT. So overall, from these findings with E-copro, we know that when E-copro decreases, we see this improvement in symptoms. And there are also overall possible links for the serum neurotransmitters, also dopamine, also serotonin, and this could help inform our pharmacological understanding of ASD in the future, and also possibly other neurodevelopmental disorders. So this is a possible future direction to take this research and take it to a drug standpoint, if some researchers should want to do that. And also that ECOPRO, maybe it needs to be investigated further for the actual biochemical mechanisms of how is it mediating GABA, and then further, how is GABA mediating the neurological and behavioral symptoms of autism, as well as affecting the GI tract. But I do find that a limitation of the study is that overall, on a broad scale, FMT didn't really change the makeup of the GI for the ASD cohort, and we just really don't know the mechanisms. So it's difficult to say that this correlation equals causation, but it is a place to start for further research on these topics. And just overall, these are good results. And this is an amazing thing that these parents found relief, that these children found a relief in their gastrointestinal issues, their behaviors, their social response levels were nearing those more similar to neurotypical children, and that maybe the gastrointestinal issues can predicate this diagnosis of ASD, or that ASD may end up, in fact, causing these gastrointestinal issues. And one thing that we did see that was really interesting in between the differences between the TD and the ASD cohort is that these children are already more likely to have food allergies. They're already more likely to have a sensitive GI tract if they have autism. So to look into that as a diagnostic criteria, this study can really help kind of put some backing behind that. And even though we didn't find any mechanisms, there is a clear correlation, and there was significant data with the serum neurotransmitters, which can help substantiate this from a neurological perspective for future studies, and also to maybe get some more advanced sequencing done for these stool samples so we can truly understand more at the beta diversity level and do some research about what ECOPRO specifically is doing to impact these serum neurotransmitter levels of GABA. And some questions just to leave you guys all with today is, do you think that this study could inspire further pharmacological research to alter neurotransmitter levels in order to mediate ASD symptoms? And what are the pros and cons of a pharmaceutical approach versus the approach taken in this clinical trial using FMT? Also, this study was conducted in Southwest China, which is a really specific region of the world. Do you think regional differences in the gut microbiomes could be a confounding factor if we want to broadly generalize and publicize the results of this study to people from completely different regions of the world? Do these results, especially the mediation of ECOPRO, would this even be a bacterium that's found in the beta level of children with ASD in America or other countries and other continents? You know, we don't know. So what do you guys think? Is that a limitation or not? Number 3, how could FMT be integrated into the pre-existing treatment plans that already exist that do take that psychotherapy model? Should it be an earlier intervention? Should it be something that occurs later down the path when psychotherapy models are struggling? Should it be incorporated? Should it replace psychotherapy? What are your guys' thoughts on that? 4, this clinical trial collected a lot of data about a lot of different things. There were a lot of independent variables. So what results out of all of the things investigated in this study, the gastrointestinal responses, the behavioral responses, the neurotransmitters, and the overall microbial diversity, which one would you want to investigate further? Which one do you think is most important to investigate further, and why? And then lastly, if you were to recreate the study, would you change any of the methods? And what are some limitations of the study that you think could be improved on? And that's all I have for everybody today. Thank you.